A young black girl walks 20 miles every single day just to get to school. Her blistered feet and tattered shoes tell a story of struggle, but her determination is unshakable. One scorching afternoon, a cop notices her walking alone on the highway and decides to follow her, thinking something's not right. What he discovers shakes him to his core. A truth about her life, her family, and a connection that will change both of their worlds forever. Why does she endure this grueling journey? And what secret is she hiding that could turn everything upside down? This is a story of heartbreak, redemption, and the extraordinary lengths one girl will go to fight for her future. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The dim glow of a flickering streetlight seeped through the thin curtains as Shaniqua Williams opened her eyes. 4:30 a.m., right on time. She blinked away the sleep and carefully sat up on her creaky bed, trying not to make any noise. The ancient springs protested softly beneath her weight. Across the small room, her younger siblings slept peacefully. Marcus sprawled out with his comic book still clutched in his hand, drool forming a small dark spot on his pillow, and little Kayla curled up tight around her worn teddy bear, its stuffing peeking out from a torn seam. Shaniqua reached for her shoes, the ones with the holes she'd carefully patched with duct tape last week when the sole started flapping. Each movement was deliberate and quiet as she slipped them on her feet, her fingers working the double-knotted laces with practiced care. Her faded backpack sat ready by the bed, stuffed with secondhand textbooks and notebooks she treasured like gold, their pages filled with her neat handwriting and carefully highlighted passages. Through the thin wall, she could hear her mother's soft snoring from the living room, punctuated by occasional deep sighs. Poor Mama had gotten home late again from her diner shift, still wearing her food-stained uniform. Shaniqua's heart ached seeing her mother sleeping on that lumpy old couch night after night, giving up her own bed so her children could be comfortable. The sacrifice wasn't lost on her. In the kitchen, lit only by the pale dawn light starting to creep in through the dusty window, Shaniqua scribbled a quick note. Morning Mama, headed to school. Made sandwiches for Marcus and Kayla's lunch. Love you. She'd prepared the peanut butter and jelly sandwiches the night before, wrapping them carefully in wax paper. She grabbed her water bottle from the fridge and eased the front door open, wincing at the slight squeak of its hinges that seemed to echo in the pre-dawn silence. The morning air was thick with humidity as Shaniqua started her long walk, her shoes crunching softly on the gravel shoulder of the road. She hummed softly, an old gospel tune her daddy used to sing before everything changed. The sun was just beginning to paint the sky in shades of pink and orange as she made her way down the cracked country road, dodging the deeper potholes she'd memorized over countless mornings. She passed Mr. Johnson's abandoned cornfield, now wild with weeds that swayed in the morning breeze, and nodded politely to Mrs. Baker, who was already out watering her roses, her floral housecoat catching the early light. The old woman smiled and waved back like she did every morning, her arthritis-curved fingers gripping her watering can. A rusty pickup truck roared past, its muffler rattling loudly, spraying muddy water all over Shaniqua's carefully pressed pants. She sighed, brushing off what she could with trembling fingers. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. She kept walking, her shoulders squared against the morning chill. 10 miles in, her legs were starting to ache, muscles burning with familiar fatigue. Shaniqua spotted her favorite oak tree, the halfway point of her journey, its massive branches spreading wide like welcoming arms. She settled in its shade for a quick break, taking small sips from her water bottle to make it last, watching an early morning cardinal flit between the branches. Her English essay was due today. My dreams for the future. The words were already forming in her mind as she rested, each sentence a step closer to her goal. Just as she approached the last stretch of her walk, a group of boys playing basketball at the corner court spotted her, their sneakers squeaking on the cracked concrete. "Hey, look who it is," one of them called out, his voice cutting through the morning air. "It's Lawyer Girl." "Where you going, Lawyer Girl? Gonna argue your way to school?" Another one jeered, bouncing the ball mockingly against the chain-link fence. Shaniqua's fists clenched at her sides until her knuckles turned white, but she kept her eyes forward and her steps steady, chin lifted with quiet dignity. Under her breath, she whispered the words that kept her going, the same words she'd repeated every morning since her daddy was taken away. I'm going to be a lawyer. I'm going to make a difference. Rick Carter groaned as he rolled out of bed, his joints protesting every movement like rusty hinges on an old gate. The morning sun streamed through his dusty blinds, already promising another scorcher of a day in the endless Georgia summer. Empty coffee cups and scattered case files covered his kitchen table, remnants of late nights spent reviewing old cases he couldn't quite let go, each folder a reminder of unfinished business. Another day in paradise, he muttered, shuffling to his coffee maker with the weariness of a man who'd seen too much. The machine sputtered and dripped while the morning news droned on in the background, the TV's glow casting shadows on his tired face. Something about a robbery 2 towns over, but Rick barely listened. After 35 years on the force, most stories started to sound the same, echoing patterns he'd seen countless times before. He glanced around his modest house, taking in the collection of faded photographs and commendations that lined the walls like silent witnesses to his career. Citations for bravery, letters of appreciation, memories of a time when the job felt more meaningful and clear-cut. Now they just gathered dust, like everything else in this town that seemed frozen in time. Rick pulled on his crisp uniform, the routine so familiar he could do it in his sleep. Badge, gun, radio. Each piece of equipment found its place with practiced ease, a ritual he'd performed thousands of times. He grabbed his keys from the hook by the door, the metal warm in his palm from the Georgia heat that seemed to seep through the walls and settle into every corner of his life. Out on patrol, Rick's cruiser hummed along the familiar back roads, its tires following grooves worn by years of the same route. Not much had changed in these parts over the decades. Same potholes, same faded street signs, same struggles playing out day after day. He passed Mary's Diner, where the neon open sign flickered weakly in the window like a tired heartbeat. The old textile factory loomed ahead, its broken windows like empty eyes staring out at nothing, a monument to better days. Look at this place, he said to himself, shaking his head at the graffiti covering the factory walls, bright colors that somehow made the building look even more desolate. Kids these days don't know the meaning of honest work. Back when that factory was running. His voice trailed off, lost in memories of bustling shifts and proud workers. He turned onto Highway 29, the less traveled route that wound through the countryside like a weathered ribbon. The sun beat down mercilessly, making the asphalt shimmer in waves of heat. That's when he spotted her. A small figure walking alone, shoulders squared against the weight of a heavy backpack that seemed too large for her frame. A young black girl, couldn't be more than 14 or 15, trudging along in shoes that had seen better days, determination evident in every step. Rick slowed his patrol car, maintaining a careful distance as he watched her through his windshield, years of instinct telling him something wasn't right. Nobody walked these roads, especially not kids, especially not alone in this heat. He eased off the gas pedal even more, following the girl's steady pace while his mind ran through possible scenarios, each one setting off warning bells from decades of experience. Shaniqua's spine tingled as she heard the slow crunch of tires on gravel behind her. She didn't need to look back to know it was a police car. The distinctive sound of its engine told her everything. Her throat went dry as memories of her mother's warnings echoed in her mind, words that had been drilled into her since she was old enough to understand. Keep your head down. Be polite. Don't give them any reason. She quickened her pace, her worn sneakers slapping against the hot asphalt. The heavy backpack bounced against her back with each step, textbooks and notebooks weighing her down like stones. Still, the patrol car crept closer, matching her speed in a way that made her skin prickle with unease. Shaniqua's heart hammered in her chest. She could feel sweat beading on her forehead, and not just from the heat. The morning sun cast long shadows across the road as the car pulled up alongside her, and she heard the electric whir of a window rolling down. The sound seemed to stretch forever in the quiet morning air. "Morning," came a gruff voice. "Where are you headed?" Shaniqua turned slightly, keeping her distance from the car. The officer inside was older, white-haired, with tired eyes that studied her carefully from beneath the brim of his hat. Deep lines marked his face like a map of years spent on patrol. She swallowed hard before answering, her mother's words playing on repeat in her mind. "To school, sir," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "School?" The officer's eyebrows rose, crinkling his weathered forehead. "Out here? That's got to be miles away." "Yes, sir. 20 miles to be exact." 20 miles? He leaned forward slightly, his hands loosening their grip on the steering wheel. "Why would you be walking 20 miles to school?" Shaniqua straightened her shoulders, lifting her chin slightly. The morning breeze rustled through her carefully pressed clothes as she stood her ground. "We can't afford a car right now, and there's no school bus that comes out this far, but I need to get to school." "And why's that so important to you?" "Because I'm going to be a lawyer," she said, the words coming out clear and strong, like she'd practiced them 1,000 times in front of her mirror. "I study hard and I never miss a day. I can't let a long walk stop me from reaching my goals." Officer Rick Carter sat back in his seat, clearly surprised by her response. His expression shifted from suspicion to something softer, more contemplative. The morning light caught the badges on his uniform as he looked at her again. Really looked at her this time. Not as a potential troublemaker, but as a young girl with determination etched into every line of her face. "A lawyer, huh?" he said, his tone different now, tinged with something that might have been respect. "Yes, sir. That's why I walk. Every day, rain or shine." Rick was quiet for a moment, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. The steady tap, tap, tap filled the space between them as his conscience wrestled with itself. "Well," he finally said, "you be careful out here, watch out for cars, and stay visible." Shaniqua nodded, relief washing over her like a cool breeze. She started walking again, her steps purposeful and steady, and Rick's patrol car remained idle. Through his rearview mirror, he watched her figure grow smaller and smaller against the sprawling Georgia landscape, her backpack bouncing with each determined step. Something heavy settled in his chest, a feeling he couldn't quite name, but it felt an awful lot like shame mixed with a dawning realization that he'd been wrong about something important. Rick slumped in his kitchen chair, pushing away a half-eaten microwave dinner. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, but his mind was elsewhere, fixed on the determined young girl he'd met that morning. Her words kept echoing in his head. "I'm going to be a lawyer." He rubbed his tired eyes and glanced at the stack of old case files in the corner. Maybe some paperwork would help clear his head. Walking over, he grabbed a handful of folders and settled back at the table. The files were dusty, filled with cases he'd worked years ago. Robberies, assaults, drug busts. They all blurred together after so many years on the force. He flipped through them mechanically until a name jumped out at him. Jerome Williams. Rick's hand froze mid-page turn. The memory hit him like a punch to the gut. A rainy night, a convenience store robbery, a man protesting his innocence as Rick slapped handcuffs on his wrists. "Let me look at this again," Rick muttered, spreading the file across the table. He began reading carefully, something he hadn't done in years. The witness statements seemed shaky now that he really studied them. The timeline didn't quite add up. The store owner's description of the suspect was vague at best. His coffee grew cold as he dug deeper into the case. According to the file, Jerome had been at work when the robbery occurred, but his time card had gone missing. His alibi witness, a co-worker, had suddenly changed their story right before the trial. Rick's stomach churned as he noticed more problems. The security camera footage was grainy, and the perpetrator's face was mostly hidden. The only solid evidence had been a partial fingerprint that could have been left days earlier when Jerome, a regular customer, had bought groceries. "Williams," Rick whispered, his mouth going dry. Shaniqua Williams. He remembered the girl's fierce determination, her long walk to school, the worn shoes, and the heavy backpack. It all made horrible sense now. Jerome Williams wasn't just another name in an old case file. He was Shaniqua's father. Rick pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. The weight of realization pressed down on his shoulders as he stared at the scattered papers before him. After all these years, he'd helped put an innocent man behind bars. And that man's daughter was now walking 20 miles to school every day, dreaming of becoming a lawyer. He sat there in the quiet kitchen, the magnitude of his discovery overwhelming him. The guilt hit him in waves, each one stronger than the last. He thought about the years Jerome had lost, the family torn apart, and the dreams that had been deferred. Rick took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he could fight to make things right. He owed it to Jerome, to Shaniqua, and to himself. With newfound resolve, he began to outline a plan in his mind. It wouldn't be easy, and it would likely cost him everything, but Rick was determined to seek justice for the Williams family. As the night wore on, Rick continued to sift through the old files, searching for any piece of evidence that could help him build a case to exonerate Jerome. He knew he had to act quickly. Shaniqua's determination had sparked something in him, a desire to right the wrongs he had been a part of for so long. The clock continued to tick, but Rick was no longer aware of the time. His focus was solely on the task at hand. He was no longer the jaded officer who had grown detached from the world around him. He was a man on a mission driven by guilt and a newfound sense of purpose. The Georgia sun beat down mercilessly on Rick as he parked his patrol car in front of the Williams house. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, the new boots sitting on the passenger seat beside him like a silent accusation. The modest house showed clear signs of wear: peeling yellow paint that had faded to a sickly shade, a crooked mailbox hanging by one rusty bracket, and wooden steps that had seen better days. A child's worn bicycle lay on its side in the patchy front yard. "Come on, Rick," he muttered to himself, wiping sweat from his forehead. "You owe them this much. It's the least you can do." He grabbed the boots and walked up to the front door, each step on the creaking porch making him more nervous. The ancient boards groaned under his weight, and somewhere nearby a cicada droned in the afternoon heat. Taking a deep breath that did little to calm his racing heart, he knocked. The door opened, revealing Latrice Williams. She wore a faded blue waitress uniform with a name tag that had been pinned and repinned countless times, dark circles under her eyes suggesting another late shift at the diner. Her expression hardened the moment she saw his badge, her whole body tensing like a spring ready to snap. "Mrs. Williams," Rick started, trying to keep his voice steady despite his dry throat. "I'm Officer Rick Carter. I saw your daughter Shaniqua walking to school yesterday, and I—" "What about my daughter?" Latrice cut in, her voice sharp with suspicion. She stepped forward slightly, as if ready to shield her home from any threat. Rick held up the boots, the box still crisp and new in his trembling hands. "I noticed her shoes were pretty worn out. I thought these might help." "We don't need your charity," Latrice snapped, crossing her arms tight across her chest. "We get by just fine on our own. Been doing it for years now." "Ma'am, I just want to help." Latrice's eyes narrowed as she studied his face, taking in every feature. Suddenly, recognition flashed across her features like a bolt of lightning. "Wait a minute. Rick Carter?" Her voice trembled with anger, years of buried pain rising to the surface. "You're the one who arrested Jerome?" Rick's stomach dropped to his feet and he felt the color drain from his face. "Mrs. Williams, please let me explain." "Explain what?" Latrice's voice rose, echoing off the peeling walls. "How you took my husband away. How my children have grown up without their father." Her hands shook as she pointed at him, fingers stabbing the air like a weapon. "You're part of the system that destroyed our lives." "I was just doing my job at the time," Rick said weakly, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I didn't—" "Your job?" Latrice laughed bitterly, the sound sharp enough to cut. "Your job was to serve and protect, not tear families apart. Do you know what it's like raising 3 kids alone? Working double shifts just to keep food on the table? Watching your children's faces every Father's Day?" Rick stood there, the boots hanging limply at his side like a guilty conscience. Every word Latrice spoke hit him like a physical blow, each one perfectly aimed at his deepest regrets. "Get off my porch," Latrice said, her voice cold as winter frost. "We don't need anything from you. Not now. Not ever." As Rick turned to leave, shoulders slumped in defeat, he caught movement in one of the windows. Shaniqua stood there, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. Their eyes met briefly, hers full of confusion and dawning understanding, before Latrice slammed the door with enough force to rattle the frame. Through the thin walls he could hear Shaniqua's voice, young and uncertain. "Mama, what's going on? Who was that officer?" "Baby." Latrice's voice cracked with emotion, years of pain bleeding through. "That's the man who arrested your daddy." Rick hurried back to his car, Shaniqua's shocked gasp following him down the walkway like an accusation. The box of boots felt heavier with each step, weighing him down with the burden of his past actions. Rick sat in his patrol car, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the dashboard. His hands still gripped the steering wheel, though the engine wasn't running. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the air conditioning. Latrice's angry words echoed in his mind. "How you took my husband away." He closed his eyes and leaned back against the headrest, feeling every one of his 30 years on the force. The weight of his badge felt heavier than usual today. All those years ago, he'd just been doing his job, or at least that's what he told himself. But now, seeing Shaniqua walking those 20 miles to school, witnessing their struggle firsthand, something didn't sit right. The image of her trudging along the dusty roadside wouldn't leave him. "I should have asked more questions," he muttered, starting the car with trembling fingers. At the station, Rick waited until most of his colleagues had left for their patrol routes before pulling Jerome's file again. The manila folder was worn at the edges, filled with papers that would change a family's life forever. Coffee stains marked the corners, remnants of late nights spent building the case. He spread the documents across his desk, this time reading every detail with fresh eyes. The fingerprints found at the robbery scene were partial at best, not nearly clear enough for a solid match. Just smudges, really, the kind that wouldn't hold up under today's standards. Rick's stomach churned as he read through the witness statements. Mrs. Peterson, the store owner, had initially said she wasn't sure about the identification, but somehow her testimony at trial had been absolutely certain. Her original statement had been buried deep in the file. "This doesn't add up," Rick whispered, flipping through more pages, his chest tightening with each revelation. Jerome's court-appointed lawyer had been fresh out of law school, handling his first major case. The kid had looked terrified throughout the proceedings. The trial transcripts showed minimal cross-examination of witnesses, no challenge to the flimsy evidence. Rick remembered watching from the witness stand as the young attorney fumbled through his questions, his hands shaking as he held his notes. He pulled out his notepad and started jotting down the inconsistencies, the pen pressing hard enough to leave indents on the next several pages. The time of the robbery didn't match the security footage timestamp. Two witnesses gave conflicting descriptions of the suspect's height. The alleged getaway car was never found. Each note felt like another nail in the coffin of his conscience. Rick ran his hands through his graying hair, noticing more silver strands in his reflection on the computer screen. The whole case stank of rushed justice, a quick conviction to close the books and boost the department's numbers. He'd seen it happen before, but he'd never let himself think about it too deeply. The familiar taste of guilt rose in his throat. Looking at the photo of Jerome clipped to the file, a younger man with Shaniqua's same determined eyes, Rick felt the full weight of his complicity. The resemblance between father and daughter was striking, right down to the slight tilt of their chin when facing adversity. He'd been so focused on following orders, on being a good cop, that he'd failed to see what was right in front of him. Footsteps in the hallway made Rick quickly gather the files, his heart racing. He knew pursuing this could end his career just months before retirement. The pension he'd counted on, the quiet life he'd planned, all of it could vanish. The department didn't take kindly to officers questioning old convictions, but as he carefully tucked the file away, he knew he couldn't walk away from this one. Some things were worth more than a comfortable retirement. The alarm buzzed at 4:30 a.m., but Shaniqua had barely slept. Her mind kept replaying yesterday's argument, the way her mother's voice cracked when she talked about Rick arresting her father. With heavy limbs, she pulled herself out of bed and got dressed in the dim light, trying not to wake her younger siblings in the cramped bedroom they shared. At school, Shaniqua tried to focus on her classes, but the morning dragged by in a blur. Her usually precise notes became scattered and messy, her hand trembling slightly as she wrote. When lunch period came, she sat alone at her usual corner table, picking at her sandwich without much appetite, the peanut butter sticking to the roof of her mouth. "Hey everybody, look who it is, the wannabe lawyer," Jessica's voice carried across the cafeteria, sharp as a knife. "Better practice your prison visits instead." Laughter rippled through the nearby tables like a cruel wave. Shaniqua gripped her milk carton tighter, staring down at her tray, watching a drop of condensation roll down the side of the carton. "I heard her daddy robbed a store," another voice chimed in, belonging to one of Jessica's faithful followers. "Guess crime runs in the family." More laughter. Shaniqua's cheeks burned, but she kept her head down, trying to remember what her mother always said about rising above. The words echoed in her mind. "Baby, sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stay quiet." Jessica wasn't done. She sauntered over to Shaniqua's table, her perfectly styled hair swinging, designer shoes clicking against the linoleum floor. "You know what's funny? You walking 20 miles to school like you're gonna be somebody. Face it, you'll never amount to anything, just like your dad." Something snapped inside Shaniqua. She shot to her feet, her lunch tray clattering against the table, sending her apple rolling across the surface. "You don't know anything about my father," she shouted, her voice echoing through the suddenly quiet cafeteria. "You don't know anything about me." "Miss Williams." Mrs. Peterson, the lunch monitor, rushed over, her sensible shoes squeaking on the floor. "That's enough." "But they were—" Shaniqua tried to explain, her voice catching in her throat. But Mrs. Peterson was already steering her toward the door, her firm grip leaving no room for argument. In the principal's office, Shaniqua sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Mr. Thompson lectured her about appropriate behavior. Her explanation about the bullying seemed to fall on deaf ears, just like everything else in this school. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, marking each second of her humiliation. "I understand you were provoked, Miss Williams," he said, writing on a discipline slip, the scratch of his pen like sandpaper on her nerves. "But we have a zero-tolerance policy for outbursts. You'll serve a one-day suspension tomorrow." The walk home felt longer than usual. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Shaniqua trudged along the familiar road, tears stinging her eyes. All those early mornings, all those miles walked, all that studying, and for what? To be suspended, to be laughed at. Her backpack felt heavier with each step, weighted down by textbooks and disappointment. She kicked a stone angrily, watching it skitter across the pavement and disappear into the tall grass by the roadside. The anger inside her felt like a living thing, clawing at her chest, demanding to be heard. She was angry at Jessica and her cruel words, at Rick for arresting her father, at her father for getting arrested in the first place, and maybe most of all, at herself for losing control. By the time her house came into view, its paint peeling and porch steps sagging, Shaniqua's feet were aching and her spirit felt crushed. Her socks were damp with sweat, and blisters were forming on her heels. The dream of becoming a lawyer, which had always burned so bright inside her, now seemed as distant as the stars. Still, somewhere deep inside, a tiny spark of determination refused to die completely. The morning air was thick with fog as Rick parked his patrol car behind an abandoned gas station. Weeds pushed through cracks in the concrete, and faded signs hung limply from rusty posts. His hands tightened around a shoebox containing a pair of sturdy walking shoes he'd bought the previous evening. The receipt was still crumpled in his pocket. $89.99, nearly a day's worth of lunch money for the next month. He'd have to brown bag it for a while, but the thought didn't bother him. "It's the least I can do," he muttered to himself, stepping out into the pre-dawn darkness. The gravel crunched beneath his feet as he moved. He walked to a flat rock beside the road, one he'd noticed Shaniqua using as a rest stop during her long trek to school. The stone was worn smooth from years of weary travelers. Carefully, he arranged the shoes side by side, making sure they were visible from the road but wouldn't get wet from the morning dew. He positioned them just so, like an offering. Back in his car, Rick slouched down in his seat and waited. The sky slowly brightened from black to purple to pink, and finally, he spotted her familiar silhouette in the distance. His heart began to race with nervous anticipation. Shaniqua's feet ached as she rounded the bend, her old shoes offering little protection against the rough asphalt. Each step sent jolts of pain through her worn soles. She was lost in thought about yesterday's suspension when something caught her eye. A pair of shoes, brand new, sitting perfectly placed on her favorite resting rock. The morning light made them gleam. She stopped, looking around nervously. The road was empty except for the occasional passing car, their headlights cutting through the remaining wisps of fog. Approaching cautiously, she picked up one of the shoes. It was exactly her size, with thick cushioned soles and proper arch support, the kind she'd been eyeing in store windows, but knew her family could never afford. The fabric was soft beneath her fingers, and that new shoe smell wafted up to her nose. "Who would?" she whispered, turning the shoe over in her hands. Her mind raced through possibilities. Maybe Ms. Johnson from church? But how would she know about this spot? Her mother? No, they barely had enough for groceries this month. The mystery of it made her heart flutter. After a final glance around, Shaniqua sat on the rock and tried them on. The difference was immediate, like walking on clouds compared to her old, worn-out sneakers. The cushioning hugged her feet perfectly, and the laces felt sturdy and secure. She stood up, taking a few experimental steps. From his hidden vantage point, Rick watched as a small smile spread across Shaniqua's face. She bounced slightly on her toes, testing the shoe's springiness, then gathered her old sneakers and tucked them into her backpack. His chest tightened with emotion at her obvious joy. As Shaniqua continued her walk, her steps were lighter, more confident. The new shoes wouldn't fix everything wrong in her life, not the suspension, not her father's absence, not the daily struggle. But for the first time in days, she felt a tiny flutter of hope in her chest. The morning sun warmed her face as she walked. Sometimes, she thought, good things could still happen even on the hardest days. Maybe this was a sign that things were about to change. The morning sun had barely peeked over the horizon when Shaniqua spotted something different near her resting rock. A brand new water bottle sat next to a spiral notebook with a bright blue cover. She stopped, her new shoes crunching on the gravel as she approached carefully, her breath catching in her throat at the unexpected sight. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing in the empty morning air. Only crickets answered back, their steady chirping a familiar soundtrack to her early morning walks. The water bottle was the expensive kind from the grocery store, the one with extra minerals that she'd seen other kids carrying at school. The notebook looked like it came from the office supply store in town, its pages thick and clean with perfectly straight lines that seemed to invite her to fill them with her neat handwriting. Shaniqua picked them up, turning them over in her hands as if searching for clues, her fingers tracing the smooth surfaces. Over the next few days, more items appeared. A pack of colored pens on Tuesday, each one with smooth flowing ink that didn't blot. Granola bars and fruit snacks on Wednesday, all her favorite flavors somehow. And a math workbook that matched exactly what they were studying in class on Thursday, complete with practice problems she'd been struggling with. Each gift was practical, thoughtful, like someone knew exactly what she needed, had been paying close attention to her life. "This is getting weird," Shaniqua muttered to herself as she collected a fresh pack of pencils on Friday morning, each one already sharpened to a perfect point. She found herself walking more slowly now, eyes scanning the trees and abandoned buildings along her route, searching for any sign of movement in the shadows. Sometimes she'd stop suddenly, hoping to catch movement or hear a car engine, but there was never anything except the whisper of wind through the leaves. The gifts made her daily journey easier, but they also made her nervous. Who was watching her? How did they know her schedule so well? The questions tumbled through her mind during her long walks, keeping her company mile after mile. One particularly hot afternoon, as Shaniqua trudged home with sweat beading on her forehead and her backpack heavy against her shoulders, something caught her eye. Far down the road, partially hidden behind an old billboard advertising a long-closed diner, sat a familiar white patrol car. Her steps faltered as she recognized the dent in the front bumper. It was Rick's car, the same one she'd seen cruising through her neighborhood for years. Her heart started beating faster, its rhythm echoing in her ears. The shoes, the supplies, the snacks. Had it been him all along? Shaniqua's hands clenched into fists as conflicting emotions washed over her like waves. Part of her felt grateful for the help, but another part burned with anger. Was this his way of trying to make up for arresting her father? Did he think a few gifts could fix what he'd done to her family? Could erase all those years of empty chairs at dinner tables and missed birthdays? She watched as the patrol car slowly backed away and disappeared down a side road, leaving only a trail of dust in its wake. Standing there in her new shoes, holding the water bottle he'd probably left, Shaniqua made up her mind. The next time she saw Officer Rick Carter, she wouldn't hide or look away. She was going to get answers, no matter how uncomfortable the conversation might be. "No more games," she whispered to herself, squaring her shoulders and continuing her walk home, each step more determined than the last. No more mysteries. The morning sun beat down mercilessly as Shaniqua spotted Rick's patrol car in its usual hiding spot behind the old billboard. Her new shoes kicked up dust as she marched toward him, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders with each determined step. The familiar scent of pine needles and hot asphalt filled the air around her. Rick saw her coming and slowly got out of his car, his weathered face showing uncertainty. He stood there, one hand resting on his car door, the other fidgeting with his badge as Shaniqua approached. The morning breeze ruffled his uniform shirt. "Why are you following me?" she demanded, her voice sharp in the quiet morning air. "Are you the one leaving all those things?" Her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. Rick shifted his weight, looking down at his boots before meeting her gaze. The lines around his eyes deepened with guilt. "Yes," he admitted quietly. "I just wanted to help make your walk easier." "Help?" Shaniqua's laugh was bitter, echoing off the billboard behind them. "Like you helped when you arrested my father? When you tore our family apart?" Rick's face fell. "Listen, Shaniqua, I didn't know who you were at first. When I saw you walking all those miles just to get to school, I was impressed by your determination. Not many kids would—" "Don't!" Shaniqua cut him off, her voice trembling with anger. Her chest heaved with emotion. "Don't act like you care now. Where was that care when you put my daddy in handcuffs? When you took him away from us?" "It's not that simple," Rick tried to explain, running a hand through his graying hair. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the early hour. "I was doing my job." "Your job?" Shaniqua's eyes flashed. "Your job ruined our lives. And now what? You think leaving me some shoes and notebooks makes everything okay? You're a hypocrite." Her voice cracked on the last word. Rick took a step forward, his hands raised. The gravel crunched beneath his heavy boots. "That's not what I—" "You're part of the system that destroyed my family," Shaniqua continued, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. Her lower lip quivered despite her efforts to stay strong. "And now you're following me around, watching me like I'm some kind of charity case. I don't want your gifts, I don't want your help." She spun around, her braids whipping through the air, and stormed off down the dusty road. Her footsteps were quick and angry, leaving Rick standing alone by his patrol car, watching her disappear into the distance. A mockingbird called from somewhere in the pines, its song a stark contrast to the tension hanging in the air. The sound of gravel crunching under her feet filled the silence as Shaniqua walked away, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt strong for finally confronting him, but her hands were shaking with frustration at his weak explanations. Each step carried her further from the man who'd helped destroy her family. Behind her, Rick leaned against his car, his shoulders slumped with the weight of shame. The metal felt hot against his back through his uniform. But beneath that shame, a determination began to grow, a resolve to make things right, whether Shaniqua wanted his help or not. His fingers drummed against his leg as his mind began working on what to do next. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Rick sat alone in the dimly lit police station. Most of his colleagues had gone home for the day, leaving only the night shift officers who were busy with their patrols. Perfect timing. He glanced around before pulling Jerome Williams's case file from his drawer, his heart pounding a little faster at what he was about to do. The manila folder was thick with papers yellowed with age. Rick spread the documents across his desk, arranging them chronologically. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, but he barely noticed as he dove into the details of the case, his weathered fingers tracing each line of text with growing concern. "This can't be right," he muttered, comparing two witness statements. The main witness, Sarah Jenkins, had changed her story 3 times before the trial. First, she claimed she saw Jerome clearly in broad daylight. Then she said it was dusk and she wasn't sure. By the trial, her story had shifted again. Now she was absolutely certain it was Jerome, even though she'd previously said the lighting was poor. The inconsistencies made Rick's skin crawl. Rick's stomach churned as he remembered his old partner, Officer Mike Daniels, who'd handled most of the witness interviews. Mike had always been proud of his high conviction rate, but there had been whispers about his methods, how he'd pressure witnesses, twist their words. Rick had ignored those rumors back then, telling himself it wasn't his business. Now that willful blindness came back to haunt him. "The surveillance footage," Rick whispered, flipping through the evidence logs, his fingers moving faster with growing urgency. "Where is it?" He distinctly remembered there being cameras at the convenience store where the robbery took place, but scanning the trial transcripts he found no mention of any video evidence. The omission was too convenient to be accidental. Jerome's court-appointed lawyer, fresh out of law school, hadn't even questioned these gaps. The kid had seemed overwhelmed, fumbling through basic procedures. Rick remembered thinking at the time that Jerome didn't stand a chance with such inexperienced representation. Now that memory filled him with shame. Hours passed as Rick pieced together the troubling puzzle. The evidence against Jerome had been circumstantial at best. No weapon was ever found, no fingerprints matched, just a shaky witness identification and Jerome's previous minor record. A couple of shoplifting charges from his teenage years that shouldn't have carried so much weight. His hands trembled slightly as he closed the file. The weight of what he'd discovered pressed down on him like a physical force. If he was right, if Jerome had been wrongfully convicted, it wasn't just about one bad arrest. It would implicate his former partner, raise questions about department practices, and possibly end several careers, including his own. The thought of losing his pension, his reputation, everything he'd worked for made his mouth go dry. Rick stared at the file on his desk, his reflection ghostly in the computer screen before him. Going further meant risking everything he'd built over his career, but staying silent meant being complicit in a grave injustice. The faces of Jerome's family flashed through his mind, his wife, his kids, all those years lost. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the empty office as Rick sat there, wrestling with his conscience. Each tick seemed to echo the years Jerome had spent behind bars, years that could never be given back. The cafeteria buzzed with the usual lunchtime chatter as Shaniqua picked at her food. The smell of overcooked vegetables and mystery meat filled the air as she tried to focus on her history textbook, propped open beside her plastic lunch tray. But Ethan's voice cut through her concentration like a knife. "Hey everybody, watch out. Don't make lawyer girl mad, she might call her daddy to defend you." Ethan's words drew snickers and whispers from nearby tables, the sound spreading like ripples in a pond. "Oh wait, he can't. He's in prison." Shaniqua's hands trembled as she gripped her fork tighter, her knuckles turning white. She kept her eyes fixed on her book, trying to remember what her mother always said about rising above it all, about being the bigger person. The words on the page blurred as tears threatened to form, and her throat felt tight with unshed emotion. "Just ignore them," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible above the cafeteria noise, but Jessica's sharp voice pierced through her defenses like an arrow. "You really think you're going to be some big-shot lawyer?" Jessica stood near Shaniqua's table, hands on her hips, her designer jeans and perfectly styled hair a stark contrast to Shaniqua's second-hand clothes. "Please, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. You'll end up just like your dad, behind bars where you belong." Something snapped inside Shaniqua like a rubber band pulled too tight. She shot to her feet, her lunch tray clattering against the table as she slammed it down, sending her milk carton toppling over. "You don't know anything about my father," she shouted, her voice echoing through the suddenly quiet cafeteria. "Or about me. You're just a mean, ignorant bully who makes yourself feel better by putting others down. Ladies! Mrs. Thompson, the lunch monitor, rushed over, her sensible shoes squeaking against the linoleum floor. That's enough! She positioned herself between the girls as other students watched with wide eyes, phones already out to record the drama. 20 minutes later, Shaniqua sat in Principal Warner's office, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The tick-tock of the wall clock seemed to mock her as she waited. Miss Williams, we have a zero-tolerance policy for disruptions, Principal Warner said, peering at her over his glasses, his desk neat and organized between them. While I understand you were provoked, your reaction was inappropriate. But they were making fun of my father, Shaniqua protested, her voice breaking like glass. They do it every day, and nobody ever stops them. Not one teacher, not one person. I'll speak with the other students involved, he replied, though his tone suggested it was an afterthought, just another box to check. But for now, you're suspended for tomorrow. After school, Shaniqua trudged along her usual route home, the late afternoon sun beating down on her shoulders. The suspension notice felt heavy in her backpack, like a brick weighing her down. How would she explain this to her mother, to her younger siblings who looked up to her as their role model? Hot tears rolled down her cheeks as she walked, leaving salty tracks on her face. All those early mornings, the long walks, the hours of studying. What was it all for? Maybe Jessica was right. Maybe she was fooling herself thinking she could become a lawyer, thinking she could rise above her circumstances. Through her tears, she barely noticed the patrol car pulling up beside her until she heard the familiar voice, gruff, but somehow gentle. Need a ride? Shaniqua looked up to see Rick behind the wheel, concern etched on his weathered face like deep valleys. She hesitated, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing away the evidence of her breakdown. The thought of walking another 10 miles in this state made her shoulders sag even more. Too exhausted to argue or maintain her anger, she nodded and climbed into the passenger seat, the cool air conditioning a small mercy against her heated skin. The patrol car hummed softly as it rolled down the dusty road, kicking up small clouds in its wake. Shaniqua pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the passenger window, watching the familiar landscape blur past, the old Johnson farm, the rusted mailboxes, the crooked fence posts that marked the miles. Her eyes were still red from crying, but her tears had dried, leaving behind a hollow ache in her chest that seemed to echo with each breath. Rick gripped the steering wheel, his calloused hands betraying his tension, as he stole occasional glances at the young girl beside him. The silence felt heavy, loaded with unspoken words and painful truths. Finally, he cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet car. I heard about what happened at school today, he said quietly, his voice gentle. I'm sorry those kids are giving you such a hard time. Shaniqua let out a bitter laugh that held no trace of humor. Sorry? You don't know the first thing about what I go through. She turned to face him, her voice tight with emotion, her hands clenched in her lap. Every single day I wake up before dawn. I walk for hours just to get to school, watching all the other kids drive past in their parents' cars. And when I finally get there, I have to deal with people who think they know everything about me and my family, who whisper and point like we're some kind of story to tell. Rick nodded slowly, his weathered face creased with concern, the afternoon sun highlighting the gray at his temples. He took a deep breath, knowing what he had to say next would change everything between them. Actually, Shaniqua, I do know something about your family. He paused, his knuckles whitening on the steering wheel as he struggled to form the words. I was one of the officers who arrested your father. The car seemed to grow smaller as the words hung in the air, heavy as storm clouds. Shaniqua went completely still, her body rigid with shock, her breath caught in her throat. Back then, the evidence seemed solid, Rick continued, his voice heavy with regret, each word seeming to age him further. But now I'm not so sure. I've been looking into the case and things don't add up. I should have asked more questions. I should have... Stop the car. Shaniqua's voice was barely a whisper, trembling with barely contained emotion. Shaniqua, please let me explain. Stop the car, she screamed, her whole body shaking, tears threatening to spill again. You You helped put my daddy in prison? All this time you knew? Those gifts, the shoes. What? Were you trying to make yourself feel better? Trying to buy your way out of guilt? Rick pulled over to the side of the road, gravel crunching under the tires like broken promises. My little brother doesn't even remember what our daddy looks like. Shaniqua's voice cracked with emotion, each word a dagger. Mama works 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. She comes home so tired she can barely stand. And you? You just went home every night like everything was fine? Like you hadn't torn our family apart? She fumbled with the door handle, her hands trembling with rage and betrayal. You have no right to feel guilty now. No right. The door flew open and she stumbled out into the afternoon heat. Stay away from me and my family. The door slammed shut with such force that the whole car shook, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Through the windshield, Rick watched helplessly as Shaniqua stormed away, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders, her steps fueled by anger and betrayal, each footfall taking her further from any chance of forgiveness. The neon sign of Joe's Diner flickered in the growing darkness, casting an uneven red glow across the nearly empty parking lot. A few scattered leaves skittered across the cracked asphalt, carried by the cool evening breeze. Rick drummed his fingers nervously on the worn Formica table, waiting for his old friend Mike to arrive. His untouched water glass had left a ring of condensation on the table's surface. The bell above the door chimed and Mike walked in, his leather briefcase tucked under one arm, looking as if he'd just left another long day at the office. You look like hell, Rick, Mike said, sliding into the booth. His salt and pepper hair was disheveled, and his reading glasses hung from a cord around his neck. The fabric of his rumpled suit jacket caught on the vinyl seat as he settled in. The waitress brought them coffee in thick ceramic mugs, and Rick waited until she was out of earshot before speaking. I need your help, Mike. It's about an old case, Jerome Williams. Mike's eyebrows shot up, his forehead wrinkling with concern. The armed robbery from 10 years ago? Why dig that up now? Rick explained about meeting Shaniqua, his growing doubts, and the inconsistencies he'd found. His voice grew hoarse with emotion as he spoke. Something's not right with this case, Mike. I can feel it in my gut. Mike leaned back, crossing his arms over his wrinkled tie. You know how messy these things can get, Rick. Start pulling threads, and the whole tapestry might unravel. Are you sure you want to do this? I have to, Rick said firmly, his jaw set with determination. I owe it to that family. Over the next week, Mike dug deep into the case, working late into the nights. His investigation revealed troubling details that made Rick's stomach churn. The key witness, Mrs. Henderson, had changed her story multiple times before settling on the version that convicted Jerome. Phone records showed dozens of calls between her and Rick's former partner, Officer Thompson, in the days leading up to the trial. Each new piece of evidence felt like another weight on Rick's conscience. There's more, Mike said during their next meeting, his voice tight with tension. Remember that surveillance footage from the convenience store? The one that supposedly malfunctioned? Rick nodded, his coffee growing cold between his hands. It didn't malfunction. I found records showing it was logged into evidence but never made it to court. And Thompson? He's got quite a history of similar mishaps, all buried in internal affairs reports. Someone went to a lot of trouble to keep these things quiet. Rick's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white with anger. We need to talk to Mrs. Henderson. She's the key to all of this. They drove to her small house on the outskirts of town. The paint was peeling, and dead flowers filled the window boxes. A rusty wind chime tinkled softly in the breeze. Mrs. Henderson opened the door just wide enough to see them, chain lock still in place. Please, Rick said, trying to keep his voice gentle and reassuring. We just need 5 minutes of your time. Fear flickered across her face, making her look older than her years. I can't help you, she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder as if expecting someone to be there. You don't understand what they'll do to me. We can protect you, Rick insisted, taking a step closer to the door. Just tell us the truth about what happened. Go away, she hissed, slamming the door in their faces. The sound echoed through the quiet neighborhood. Rick slumped in his car seat, staring at Mrs. Henderson's house through the windshield. The setting sun cast long shadows across her overgrown lawn, and a cat darted beneath her porch. The truth was so close he could almost taste it, but without her testimony they were stuck. Mike's words echoed in his head about pulling threads, and now he understood just how tangled this web really was. The weight of 10 years of injustice pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden. The early morning sun cast long shadows across Rick's driveway as he stepped out of his house, coffee mug in hand. The familiar aroma of dark roast did nothing to settle his nerves today. The sight before him made him freeze mid-step, hot coffee sloshing dangerously close to the rim. His patrol car's windshield was a spiderweb of broken glass, glinting in the sunlight like scattered diamonds. A white piece of paper fluttered on the hood, held down by a rock dancing in the gentle breeze. His hands shook slightly as he picked up the note, coffee forgotten on the hood of his car. "Stay out of this." The words, typed in plain black letters, sent a chill down his spine. He ran his thumb over the paper, feeling the slight indentations from the printer. At the station, Rick filed a vandalism report but kept his suspicions to himself, swallowing the bitter taste of fear and anger. "Probably just some kids," he told the desk sergeant with a forced smile, knowing full well it wasn't true. That night, the phone rang while he was reviewing case files, papers spread across his kitchen table. "Last warning," a distorted voice growled before hanging up. Rick's jaw clenched, but he kept working, though his pen pressed harder into the paper than necessary. 2 days later, the crash of breaking glass jolted him awake, his heart leaping into his throat. A brick lay on his living room floor, surrounded by shattered window fragments like a frozen explosion. Rick's heart pounded as he checked outside, gun drawn, but the street was empty except for the whisper of wind through the trees. Across town, Latrice Williams answered her ringing phone, balancing a basket of laundry on her hip. "Keep your daughter away from that cop," a harsh voice warned, "or things will get worse." She slammed the phone down, her hands trembling, the laundry basket forgotten at her feet. "Shaniqua," Latrice called out, her voice tight with worry. When her daughter appeared from her bedroom, Latrice's eyes were filled with tears, her normally strong facade cracking. "What have you gotten mixed up in with that officer?" Shaniqua sat at their small kitchen table, shoulders slumped, fingers tracing the worn patterns in the wood. "He's trying to help Dad, Mama. He thinks he can prove Dad's innocent." "Help?" Latrice's voice cracked like thin ice. "We're getting threatening calls because of him. This needs to stop before someone gets hurt." Her hands clutched the back of a kitchen chair, knuckles white with tension. Shaniqua stared at her hands, conflict written across her face, her mother's fear warring with her own desperate hope. "But what if this is our only chance to get Dad back?" Later that night, Rick's car crunched over gravel as he pulled up to the Williams house, his headlights cutting through the darkness. He found Shaniqua sitting on the porch steps, her face illuminated by the dim porch light, shadows dancing across her worried features. "I won't stop," Rick said quietly, standing before her, his badge catching the yellow light. "No matter what they do to try to scare us off, I owe your father the truth." His voice carried the weight of years of guilt and determination. Shaniqua looked up at him, fear and determination battling in her eyes. She nodded slowly, though her hands gripped the wooden step until her knuckles turned white, splinters threatening to pierce her skin. The morning sun cast long shadows across the empty road as Shaniqua spotted Rick's patrol car parked in its usual spot. Her steps slowed, and she took a deep breath before changing direction to walk toward him. Her hands were balled into fists at her sides, but her chin was held high. The weight of her backpack, heavy with textbooks, seemed to mirror the burden she carried in her heart. Rick noticed her approach and rolled down his window, his weathered face careful and uncertain. The early morning breeze carried the scent of his coffee into the crisp air. "Morning, Shaniqua." "I'm still mad at you," she said firmly, adjusting her backpack strap. Her voice trembled slightly, but she steadied it. "But I want to know what you found out about my dad's case." Rick nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. The lines in his face seemed deeper in the morning light. "Want to skip school today? There's a lot to go through." Shaniqua hesitated only briefly before climbing into the passenger seat, keeping herself pressed against the door. Rick drove them to the local library, explaining what he and Mike had discovered along the way. The car's quiet hum filled the spaces between his words. "The main witness?" Rick said, pulling into a parking spot beneath a towering oak tree. "They were pressured into lying, and there was security camera footage that could have helped your father, but it mysteriously disappeared before the trial." His fingers drummed nervously on the steering wheel as he spoke. Inside the library, they claimed a quiet corner table near a window where sunlight streamed through dusty blinds. Rick spread out photocopies of case documents while Shaniqua pulled out her notebook, its pages already filled with her neat handwriting. Her anger seemed to fade as she focused on the information before her, replaced by intense concentration. "So how do we prove the witness was forced to lie?" she asked, leaning forward, her braids falling over her shoulder. "That's where it gets tricky," Rick admitted. He pulled out a thick law book, its pages worn from years of use. "We need to understand exactly how appeals work." They spent hours going through legal texts and online resources. Shaniqua absorbed everything quickly, asking questions that impressed Rick with their insight. Her fingers flew across her phone's screen as she looked up legal terms, determined to understand every detail. "What if we focused on the missing footage first?" she suggested, tapping her pen against her notebook. Her eyes sparkled with intelligence. "That seems like a clear violation of evidence rules." Rick raised his eyebrows, sitting up straighter in his chair. "That's actually a really good point. The prosecution had a duty to preserve that evidence." He shuffled through some papers with renewed energy. Shaniqua's eyes lit up as she scribbled more notes, her hand moving rapidly across the page. Though she still kept her distance emotionally from Rick, her passion for the legal work was obvious. She'd occasionally mutter legal terms under her breath, testing how they felt on her tongue. As evening approached, golden light filtering through the library windows, Shaniqua gathered her things, her notebook now filled with detailed notes and ideas. She carefully arranged everything in her backpack, taking extra time with the papers Rick had shared. She paused at the library entrance where the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Thank you," she said quietly, not quite meeting Rick's eyes, before turning and walking toward home. Her shoulders were straight, her stride purposeful. Rick watched her go, struck by how she'd pushed aside her justified anger to focus on helping her father. Her determination, despite everything she'd been through, was remarkable. The sight of her walking away, silhouetted against the sunset, reminded him of just how young she was to be carrying such a heavy burden. The morning air was crisp as Shaniqua pushed open the door of Joe's Diner, the bell jingling softly above her head. The familiar smell of coffee and bacon wrapped around her as she stepped inside. Rick was already there, sitting in a corner booth with papers spread across the worn Formica table. She approached cautiously, her notebook clutched tight against her chest, her heart beating a little faster. "Good morning," Rick said, gathering some papers to make space for her. His coffee cup was already half empty, suggesting he'd been there a while. Shaniqua slid into the booth, keeping her distance. The vinyl seat squeaked beneath her. "Morning." She ordered a coffee when the waitress came by, then pulled out her pen, uncapping it with steady fingers. "Show me what you found." Rick spread out several documents, pointing to highlighted sections with a weathered finger. "Here's where things don't add up. The witness statement changed 3 times before the trial." He pushed a stack of papers toward her, the edges slightly yellowed with age. "See how the story gets more detailed each time? That's not normal. First statement's basic, but by the third, they're suddenly remembering specific words, times, everything." Shaniqua studied the statements carefully, her brow furrowed as she leaned over the papers. "They were coached," she said, not looking up, her voice tight with certainty. "Someone told them what to say." "Exactly." Rick nodded, impressed by her quick understanding. "And there's more. The surveillance footage that went missing? It wasn't just lost, it was deliberately removed from evidence. Someone wanted it gone. Is that legal?" Shaniqua's pen moved quickly across her notebook, the scratching sound sharp in the quiet booth. No, it's not. It's called spoliation of evidence. Rick pulled out another document, this one protected in a clear plastic sleeve. Mike found this. It's a receipt showing the footage was checked out of evidence storage 3 days before the trial. Never checked back in, just vanished. Shaniqua's eyes narrowed, a flash of anger crossing her face. Who checked it out? That's where it gets complicated. Rick lowered his voice, leaning forward slightly. It was my old partner, Detective Thompson. We worked together for 15 years. The waitress brought Shaniqua's coffee in a thick white mug, steam rising in lazy spirals, and they waited until she walked away before continuing, both aware of the sensitivity of their conversation. So what's our next move? Shaniqua asked, her voice steady despite the anger Rick could see simmering in her eyes. She wrapped her hands around the warm mug, but didn't drink. Mike's going to keep digging into Thompson's other cases, see if there's a pattern. We need to know if this was a one-time thing or not. Meanwhile, we need legal precedents, similar cases where evidence tampering led to conviction reversals. Shaniqua was already writing, her pen flying across the page. I can research those. The school library has legal databases. I know how to use them. Are you sure? It's a lot of work, and with your regular schoolwork. Rick's concern was evident in his voice. I can handle it. She cut him off firmly, looking up with steely determination. This is more important. This is my father's life. Rick nodded, respecting her determination. Okay, we'll meet again next week, same time. Fine. Shaniqua gathered her notes and stood up, sliding them carefully into her backpack. But this doesn't mean I forgive you. I know, Rick said quietly, his eyes dropping to his coffee cup. I'm doing this for my dad, not you. I understand. Shaniqua headed for the door, declining Rick's offered ride with a sharp shake of her head. He watched through the smudged diner window as she walked away, her backpack heavy with notes, but her steps determined. The morning sun caught her face, highlighting a strength that reminded him painfully of her father. The streetlights cast long shadows as Rick and Mike hunched over a stack of papers in Rick's dimly lit living room. Empty coffee cups littered the table between them, evidence of their long night. Got him, Mike said suddenly, tapping his finger on a document. Earl Thompson. He's living in Millbrook, about 3 hours south. Rick leaned forward, studying the address. You sure it's him? Matches the age, physical description, and his work history lines up. He's working at a gas station there now. Rick checked his watch. 11:30 p.m. First thing tomorrow, then. The next morning, Rick's patrol car rolled down a narrow street lined with weathered houses. He found Earl's place at the end, a small house with peeling paint and a crooked mailbox. His knock echoed against the thin door. After a long moment, it opened just enough to reveal a thin man with graying hair and tired eyes. Earl Thompson? The man's eyes widened with recognition and fear. He tried to slam the door, but Rick wedged his foot in the gap. Please, Rick said softly. 5 minutes, that's all I'm asking. Earl's hands shook as he reluctantly opened the door. Make it quick. Inside, Earl perched nervously on the edge of a worn armchair while Rick sat on the couch. I'm here about Jerome Williams's trial, Rick said carefully. Earl's face went pale. I shouldn't talk about that. Your testimony was the key evidence that put him away. But it wasn't true, was it? Earl's eyes darted to the window. You don't understand, I had no choice. Joe McAllister? Rick said. He pressured you, didn't he? Earl's hands trembled harder. He said he'd arrest me. Said he had evidence linking me to some break-ins. Said he'd make sure I went away for a long time if I didn't cooperate. So you testified that you saw Jerome at the robbery? I didn't see anything, Earl burst out. I was nowhere near that store that night. McAllister told me exactly what to say. Made me practice it until I got it right. Rick leaned forward. Earl, we need you to come forward with this. Make a formal statement. No. Earl stood up abruptly. No way. You don't know what they're capable of. McAllister's got friends everywhere. They already warned me once when someone started asking questions last year. We can protect you. Like you protected Jerome? Earl backed away. I'm sorry about what happened to him. I really am. But I've got a family to think about. Rick tried to argue, but Earl was already opening the door. Please leave. Don't come back here. Walking back to his car, Rick felt the weight of defeat pressing down on him. Without Earl's testimony, proving Jerome's innocence would be nearly impossible. And worse, he now knew just how corrupt his former partner truly was. Rick stared at the note taped to his front door, his jaw clenching as he read the words. Last warning, drop it. The morning sun cast long shadows across his weathered porch as he crumpled the paper and tossed it in the trash. His hands were steady, but his heart raced. These threats only strengthened his resolve. He'd seen too much corruption to back down now. At the station, the usual morning chatter died down when he walked in. Coffee cups paused halfway to lips, and keyboards fell silent. Officer Thompson quickly looked away when their eyes met. Jenkins pretended to be absorbed in paperwork, shuffling the same pages over and over. The silence felt heavy, meaningful, the kind that screamed louder than words. His phone buzzed. Mike. Rick. Mike's voice was low, urgent, barely above a whisper. We've got trouble. Someone's been asking around about us. My contacts say there have been questions about what we're digging into. They're not being subtle about it. Rick's stomach tightened into a knot. How much do they know? Enough to be dangerous. Watch your back. These aren't the kind of people who just make idle threats. Later that afternoon, Latrice Williams's hands shook as she answered another anonymous call, nearly dropping the phone before getting it to her ear. Keep your daughter away from that cop, the voice growled, cold and menacing. Or something might happen to her on that long walk to school. It's a dangerous road, lots of blind spots. The phone clattered from her trembling fingers, hitting the kitchen floor with a crack. When Shaniqua came home, Latrice was waiting by the door, worry etched deep in her face. No more, she said firmly, her voice leaving no room for argument. You're done working with that officer. Mom, we're so close to proving Dad's innocent. I don't care, Latrice's voice cracked with raw emotion. They threatened you, baby. They threatened my baby. I can't lose you too. But Dad is safer in prison than you are right now? Latrice pulled her daughter close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. Please, just stop. For me. The knock at their door made them both jump, hearts racing. Rick stood there, his expression grave, shoulders heavy with the weight of what he had to say. Mrs. Williams, I need to explain what's happening. No. Latrice stepped between him and Shaniqua, her body rigid with protective anger. You've done enough. First you helped put my husband away. Now you're putting my daughter in danger? I'm trying to protect her. Like you protected Jerome? Latrice's eyes flashed with years of built-up pain. Stay away from my family. We don't need your help and we don't want it. Haven't you done enough damage? After Rick left, Shaniqua sat in her room, staring at her notebook filled with case notes and carefully gathered evidence. Her mother's fear was real. She could still hear the tremor in her voice. But so was her father's innocence. Quietly, she opened her laptop and continued her research, promising herself to be more careful, more secretive. She wouldn't give up. Not now. Not when they were so close to the truth that would finally bring her father home. Rick's phone lit up at 11:45 p.m., Mike's number flashing on the screen. He grabbed it quickly, hoping for good news, his heart skipping a beat as his fingers fumbled with the answer button. Rick, I found someone, Mike said, his voice urgent and slightly breathless. A waitress who worked at the diner during Jerome's arrest. Her name's Tina. She overheard something important between the officers that night. Rick sat up straighter, his back rigid against his old armchair. What did she hear? She won't tell me over the phone, but she's willing to meet. She's staying at the Pine Grove Motel, room 112. Says she's only in town for a few days. The next morning, Rick picked up Shaniqua in his patrol car. They drove in tense silence until they reached the motel, a worn-down building with peeling paint and rusty railings. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the crumbling parking lot, highlighting years of neglect. Tina answered their knock cautiously, chain lock still in place. Her eyes darted between Rick and Shaniqua before she let them in, her hands shaking slightly as she undid the lock. The small room smelled of cigarettes and cheap coffee, with fast food wrappers scattered across the bedside table. "I don't know about this," Tina said, wringing her hands, her weathered face lined with worry. "I could get in trouble." Shaniqua stepped forward, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "Please, my father's been in prison for 10 years. We just want the truth." "I have 3 kids myself," Shaniqua continued, pulling out a photo of her family from her backpack, the edges worn from frequent handling. "We haven't hugged our dad in a decade, haven't celebrated birthdays or holidays together. If you know something that could help." Tina's expression softened as she looked at the photo. She sank into a chair by the window, the morning light illuminating the gray streaks in her hair. "I was working the late shift," she began quietly, staring at her hands. "Officer McAllister came in with another cop. They sat in my section, talking like I wasn't even there." She paused, glancing nervously at Rick. "McAllister was laughing about how fast they closed the case, said it didn't matter if Jerome actually did it or not. They needed a conviction to keep the stats up. Said something about pressure from above." Shaniqua's hands trembled as she wrote everything down in her notebook, her knuckles white against the blue spiral binding. "I'll tell you what I heard," Tina said firmly, straightening her shoulders. "But I won't testify. I can't risk it. My word against the cops won't mean much anyway. I've got my own family to think about." Rick nodded, understanding the weight of her fear. "We'll keep your name out of it. You have my word." As they left the motel, Shaniqua turned to Rick, squinting against the bright sunlight. "Thank you," she said softly, "for letting me come, for letting me be part of this." Rick watched her clutch her notebook tight against her chest, seeing not just a determined teenager, but a daughter fighting for her father's freedom. Maybe, he thought, they were finally getting somewhere. This could be the break they'd been waiting for. The afternoon sun painted long shadows across the dashboard as Rick steered the patrol car back toward town. Next to him, Shaniqua's pen scratched against paper as she reviewed her notes from their meeting with Tina. The leather seat creaked beneath her as she shifted, double-checking important details. Rick kept glancing in his rearview mirror, years of police work having taught him to stay alert and trust his instincts. That's when he noticed it. A black SUV, 3 cars back, matching their every lane change with unsettling precision. "Everything okay?" Shaniqua asked, looking up from her notebook. She'd noticed his grip tightening on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. "Just being careful," Rick said, switching lanes again. The SUV followed, smooth and deliberate. "Hold on tight to those notes." Rick's suspicions grew as the SUV accelerated, its tinted windows revealing nothing about the driver. The afternoon sun glinted off its polished black paint as it drew closer, headlights flashing aggressively in a clear message to move aside. "Are they following us?" Shaniqua's voice trembled slightly as she clutched her notebook, her earlier confidence replaced by uncertainty. "Don't worry," Rick said, though his jaw was clenched tight enough to ache. "I know these roads like the back of my hand." He yanked the wheel hard, turning suddenly onto a narrow side street lined with old oak trees. The SUV swerved to follow, its engine roaring like an angry beast. Rick's patrol car bounced as he took another sharp turn, then another, the tires squealing in protest. The SUV stayed right on their tail, getting closer with each turn, close enough that Rick could make out the chrome grille in his mirror. "Rick!" Shaniqua gasped as the SUV pulled alongside them, nearly scraping their car. The sound of metal threatening to meet metal filled the air. Rick downshifted and accelerated hard, spotting a barely visible dirt road ahead through a gap in the trees. He cut the wheel sharply, dust and gravel flying as they bounced onto the unpaved track. The SUV's brakes squealed as it tried to make the turn but missed, the driver's frustration evident in the roar of the engine. Rick didn't slow down until he found a dense cluster of pine trees. He pulled behind them, cut the engine, and they sat in tense silence, listening to the SUV's engine fade into the distance. The only sound was their heavy breathing and the tick of the cooling engine. "You okay?" Rick asked, turning to Shaniqua. She nodded, but her hands were shaking as she held her notebook. Pages crumpled from her tight grip. That was... She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Who were they? I don't know, Rick admitted, his expression grim. But we'll be careful from now on. Very careful. They waited several minutes before Rick carefully drove them back to the main road, taking a longer route to avoid any chance of running into their pursuer. When they finally pulled up in front of Shaniqua's house, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Listen, Rick said as she gathered her things, his voice heavy with concern. If you notice anything suspicious, anything at all, you call me right away, day or night. Understand? Shaniqua nodded, clutching her notebook to her chest like a shield. As she walked to her front door, her legs still shaky from the chase, she couldn't help wondering if pursuing her father's case was worth putting herself, and maybe her family, in danger. The weight of that question followed her inside, heavier than her backpack full of schoolbooks. The early morning sun hadn't yet reached the windows of the police station when Rick arrived. The building was quiet, with only the night shift finishing up their paperwork. Rick nodded to the desk sergeant and headed straight for the archives in the basement. His footsteps echoed in the empty stairwell as he descended. The archive room smelled of dust and old paper, illuminated by flickering fluorescent lights. Rick's hands trembled slightly as he used his key to unlock the heavy door. He knew what he was about to do could end his career, but the image of Shaniqua's determined face kept him moving forward. Row after row of metal filing cabinets stretched before him. Rick moved methodically through them, checking dates and case numbers. His breath caught when he finally found what he was looking for: a thick manila envelope labeled Williams Jerome Case Evidence. Inside, buried beneath routine paperwork, he found it: a surveillance footage analysis report that had never seen the light of day. Rick's eyes widened as he read. The report clearly stated that Jerome had been captured on camera outside the diner when the robbery was taking place inside. It was ironclad proof of his innocence. But there, at the bottom of the page, was Joe McAllister's signature next to the word "inconclusive," written in bold red ink. The date showed it had been filed just days before Jerome's trial. Rick's hands shook as he pulled out his phone and carefully photographed each page. As he dug deeper into the file, he found more damning evidence: internal affairs reports about Joe, complaints about witness intimidation, and notes about evidence that had conveniently disappeared from other cases. "What are you doing down here so early, Rick?" The voice made him freeze. Officer Thompson stood in the doorway, coffee cup in hand. "Just reviewing some old cases," Rick said casually, sliding the file back into place. "You know how it is. Retirement coming up, feeling nostalgic." Thompson seemed to accept this and moved on. Rick waited until the footsteps faded before letting out the breath he'd been holding. Back in his car, Rick stared at the photos on his phone. The evidence was clear. Joe had buried proof of Jerome's innocence and likely strong-armed witnesses into false testimony. Publishing this would destroy Joe's reputation, but it would also implicate others in the department who had looked the other way. Rick's own career, his pension, his reputation, all of it would be collateral damage. He looked at the photos again, knowing they could change everything. Captain Mills's office felt smaller than usual as Rick sat across from his superior. The morning light filtering through the blinds cast stark shadows across the captain's weathered face. "Carter, we need to talk about your recent activities," Mills said, leaning back in his chair. "People are noticing. You're digging into old cases, spending time in the archives. It's raising eyebrows." Rick maintained eye contact but stayed silent. "Look, you're 3 months from retirement, 30 years of service, full pension." Mills tapped his desk with his index finger. "Would be a shame to throw that all away now." "Sir, I'm just trying to make sure justice was served," Rick replied, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Drop it, Carter, that's not a suggestion." Mills's tone hardened. "You've got too much to lose." After leaving the chief's office, Rick walked through the station feeling the weight of every stare. His colleagues quickly looked away when he passed, pretending to be absorbed in their work. Meanwhile, at the public library, Shaniqua sat surrounded by legal textbooks. Her notebook was filled with careful annotations as she researched past cases. Her eyes lit up when she found what she was looking for: Martinez versus State of Georgia, a case where a conviction was overturned due to coerced witness testimony. That evening, Rick's phone rang just as he was finishing dinner. The voice on the other end was distorted. "Back off, Carter. The Williams girl walks 20 miles alone every day. Be a shame if something happened to her." Rick's hand tightened around the phone. He immediately called Shaniqua. "They're making threats about you now," he told her. "Maybe we should take a step back." "No," Shaniqua's voice was firm. "I won't stop fighting for my dad. We're too close." After hanging up, Rick grabbed his keys and drove to Shaniqua's neighborhood. He parked his car where he could see her house clearly, settled in for a long night, and kept watch. The street was quiet except for the occasional passing car and the distant bark of dogs. Shaniqua arrived at the library as soon as it opened, her worn backpack heavy with notebooks. She claimed her usual spot near the law section, spreading her materials across the wooden table. Her English teacher, Ms. Thompson, noticed her focused determination and quietly placed a sandwich next to her work. "Keep going, Shaniqua. You're doing amazing work," Ms. Thompson whispered before walking away. Hour after hour, Shaniqua pored over legal texts and online databases. Her hand cramped from taking notes, but she didn't stop. Around midday, her eyes landed on something that made her heart race. Watson versus State of Georgia, 1998. The case detailed how a conviction was overturned when evidence emerged that police had suppressed key testimony and coerced witnesses. "Just like Dad's case," she muttered, quickly jotting down the details. Meanwhile, Rick sat in a dimly lit diner booth across from Mike, sliding the photos of the buried report across the table. "This is dynamite, Rick," Mike said, examining the photos. "We should get this to the press. Channel 7 would run with it in a heartbeat." Rick rubbed his temples. "If we do that, it'll blow back on everyone involved." "My career, sure. But what about the other officers? The department?" "Since when do you care about protecting corrupt cops?" Mike challenged. Rick had no answer for that. Later that evening, Shaniqua called Rick from her bedroom, her voice excited as she shared her discoveries. "I found this case, Watson versus State of Georgia," she explained. "The details match almost exactly. Suppressed evidence, coerced witnesses. They got the conviction overturned." Rick listened, impressed by her thoroughness. "You're doing incredible work, Shaniqua. Really incredible. Your research could make a real difference." For the first time since starting this journey, Shaniqua felt truly useful. She wasn't just a victim's daughter anymore. She was actively fighting for justice. After hanging up, Shaniqua sat at her small desk, picking up the framed photo of her father. It was taken at her 8th birthday party, just weeks before his arrest. His smile was bright and genuine. "I'm going to bring you home, Dad," she whispered to the photo. The morning sun cast long shadows as Rick's patrol car pulled onto the dusty road leading to Earl Thompson's house. Shaniqua sat in the passenger seat, nervously reviewing her notes. Mike's car followed close behind them. "Remember," Rick said softly, "let him know we can protect him. Just speak from your heart." Shaniqua nodded, her fingers tracing the worn edges of her notebook. When they arrived at Earl's house, it looked even more run down than before. Paint peeled from the wooden siding, and the front steps sagged under their weight. Earl wouldn't open the door at first. They could hear movement inside, but their knocks went unanswered. "Mr. Thompson," Shaniqua called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Please, I need to talk to you about my father, Jerome Williams. I'm his daughter, and I just want the truth to come out." There was a long pause before they heard the lock click. Earl opened the door just enough to see them. His eyes were tired, and his hands shook as he gripped the doorframe. "I can't help you," he mumbled. "They'll come after me." "We can protect you," Rick assured him. "This is Mike, a private investigator. He can help us keep your identity confidential." Earl hesitated, then slowly opened the door wider. They followed him into a dimly lit living room where papers and empty coffee cups cluttered every surface. My father's been in prison for 10 years, Shaniqua said, her voice steady despite her watering eyes. 10 years of birthdays, holidays, everything. Gone. If you know something that could help him, please. Earl sank into an old armchair, running his hands over his face. Officer McAllister, he started, his voice barely above a whisper. He said if I didn't testify against Jerome, he'd make sure I went down for some old charges. I had kids to think about. Mike pulled out some papers from his briefcase. We can draft an affidavit right now. You won't have to appear in court. Just tell us what really happened. Earl looked at Shaniqua, then back at Rick. McAllister used to brag about it, you know. Said he could close any case fast if he needed to. Didn't matter if they were guilty or not. With trembling hands, Earl signed the affidavit Mike prepared. Shaniqua wiped tears from her eyes as she watched him write his name. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you so much. Rick placed a reassuring hand on Earl's shoulder. You did the right thing. We'll make sure you're protected. They left Earl standing in his doorway, his face a mixture of fear and relief as their cars pulled away from his house. Rick spread the affidavit papers across his kitchen table, while Shaniqua and Mike reviewed each page carefully. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, highlighting the dust particles dancing in the air. Everything looks solid, Mike said, adjusting his reading glasses. Earl's statement matches the evidence we found in those buried files. Shaniqua nodded, her eyes scanning the documents. Do you think it'll be enough? Combined with the surveillance footage report? It's our strongest lead yet, Rick replied. Later that evening, Shaniqua walked through her front door to find the house filled with the warm smell of her mother's cooking. Latrice stood at the stove, humming softly while stirring a pot of stew. Mama, you're cooking your special recipe? Shaniqua asked, surprised. Sure am, baby. Latrice smiled, a rare sight these days. Marcus, stop chasing your sister and help set the table. Marcus and Kayla giggled as they grabbed plates and silverware. The kitchen felt lighter somehow, more like it used to before everything happened. Just as they were sitting down to eat, Rick's phone buzzed violently. He answered to hear Mike's panicked voice. Rick, Earl's house, it's on fire, he's nowhere to be found. Rick's stomach dropped. I'll be right there. He rushed to his car and drove to Shaniqua's house, knowing she'd want to come despite the risk. When they arrived at Earl's property, flames had already consumed most of the structure. Fire trucks surrounded the area, their red lights painting everything in an eerie glow. The acrid smell of smoke filled the air. Any sign of him? Rick asked Mike, who stood nearby looking pale. Nothing, Mike shook his head. But neighbors saw that black SUV again, parked right out front before the fire started. Shaniqua wrapped her arms around herself, her voice barely audible. Do you think he's okay? We don't know, Mike replied grimly. No body found, but no trace of where he went either. They watched as firefighters doused the last of the flames, the house now nothing more than a smoking skeleton. Rick noticed several officers taking photos and statements, but something about their casual demeanor made him uneasy. The drive back to Shaniqua's house was heavy with silence. Streetlights flashed across their faces as they drove through the empty streets. When they pulled up to her house, Shaniqua turned to Rick before getting out. We can't stop now, she said firmly. We're too close. The morning sun had barely risen when Rick slipped into the back booth of a quiet diner on the outskirts of town. Mike was already there, nursing a cup of coffee, his face drawn with worry. Found something big, Mike said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. Been digging through McAllister's old files. You need to see this. Mike pulled out a weathered manila folder and slid it across the table. Inside was a document that made Rick's hands shake as he read it. The report, signed by McAllister himself, stated clearly that the surveillance footage from the diner did not provide useful information for the investigation. But we know that's a lie, Rick whispered, his coffee growing cold and forgotten. The footage showed Jerome wasn't even there during the robbery. Exactly, Mike nodded grimly. McAllister deliberately buried evidence that would have cleared Jerome. This report proves it. Rick ran his hand through his gray hair, his stomach churning. Using this document would expose years of corruption, but it would also implicate many others in the department. His own career, his pension, everything he'd worked for. It would all be at risk. Later that afternoon, Shaniqua joined them at the diner. Her eyes grew wide as she read the document, her hands gripping the paper so tightly it crinkled at the edges. "This proves it," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "This proves they knew my dad was innocent and locked him up anyway." Rick shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "It's complicated, Shaniqua. Using this document could have serious consequences. A lot of people could lose their jobs, including me. The whole department could—" "My dad's been in prison for 12 years, Shaniqua cut him off, her eyes flashing. "You're worried about your career?" Rick stared at the damning document on the table between them, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like a physical thing. The sunrise found Rick sitting at his kitchen table, surrounded by empty coffee cups and the weight of his decision. He hadn't slept all night, his mind racing with possibilities and consequences. But as the morning light filtered through his window, clarity finally came. At the diner, Shaniqua and Mike were already waiting in their usual booth. Rick slid in across from them, his face tired but determined. "I'm going to do it," he said simply. "We're going to leak the document." Shaniqua's eyes widened while Mike nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of the decision. "You need to understand what this means," Rick continued, his voice low and serious. "I'll probably be suspended immediately. The department could press charges against me. My pension, my reputation, it'll all be gone." "But my father's freedom," Shaniqua started. "Is worth more than any of that," Rick finished. "I know, that's why I'm doing it." Mike pulled out his phone. "I know a journalist at the Herald. She's been investigating police corruption for years. We can trust her to handle this right." As they discussed the details, Rick's phone buzzed. Captain Mills' name flashed on the screen. Rick stepped outside to take the call. "Carter," Mills's voice was sharp. "What exactly have you been working on?" "Just following up on some old cases, sir." "Don't play dumb with me. You're digging into things that need to stay buried. Stop now, or there will be consequences." Rick ended the call without responding, his jaw set with determination. Back inside, Mike was already drafting an email to his contact at the Herald, carefully laying out the evidence they'd gathered. Shaniqua watched over his shoulder, her face a mix of hope and anxiety. That evening, Rick sat alone in his living room, staring at his laptop screen. The Herald's website refreshed, and suddenly, there it was, the headline blazing across his screen. "Police corruption exposed. Evidence suppressed in Williams case." The article detailed everything: McAllister's falsified report, the buried surveillance footage, the pattern of misconduct. Rick felt his chest tighten as he read, knowing there was no going back now. His phone started buzzing with messages and calls, but he ignored them all. Instead, he sat in his darkened living room, feeling both lighter and heavier than he had in years. The morning sun had barely risen when Rick's phone exploded with notifications. The Herald's headline blazed across his screen: "Corruption exposed. Officers' false evidence led to wrongful conviction." His hands trembled as he scrolled through the article, seeing McAllister's name in bold print alongside details of the falsified evidence and coerced testimony. Within minutes, his phone rang. Captain Mills's name flashed on the screen. Before Rick could answer, 3 more calls came in from various news outlets. He ignored them all, knowing what was coming. At the station, the usual morning bustle had turned to tense whispers. Officers avoided his gaze as he walked to Captain Mills's office, where 2 internal affairs investigators waited with stern expressions. "Sit down, Carter," Mills ordered, his face red with anger. "Care to explain how classified department documents ended up in the Herald?" Rick met their stares steadily. "The article speaks for itself, doesn't it?" "Did you leak those documents?" one of the IA investigators demanded. "I believe in justice being served," Rick replied carefully. "That's all I have to say." Mills slammed his hand on the desk. "Turn in your badge and gun, Carter. You're suspended pending investigation, and let me be clear, your career is finished." Rick placed his badge and gun on the desk without argument. The weight lifted from his belt felt strange, like losing a part of himself. He walked out of the station, head held high despite the stares following him. Across town, Shaniqua walked through her school hallways, noticing the difference immediately. The usual taunts were replaced by awkward silence. Students who'd mocked her father now looked away quickly, shuffling past. Her English teacher, who'd always been kind, squeezed her shoulder supportively as she passed. During lunch, the cafeteria fell quiet when she entered. Jessica, who had led the bullying, sat at her usual table but didn't look up. Shaniqua felt their eyes on her as she walked to an empty table, her head high. The article had changed everything, but she knew this was just the beginning of their fight. Rick sat in his car in the station parking lot, staring at the empty space where his badge had lived for decades. The leather holder felt light, almost meaningless now. But as he ran his fingers over the worn material, a small smile crossed his face. For the first time in years, he felt clean. The courthouse buzzed with nervous energy as Shaniqua sat between her mother and Rick, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The judge, a stern-faced woman with silver-rimmed glasses, carefully reviewed the stack of documents before her. "Your Honor," the defense attorney began, "the evidence clearly shows that Mr. Williams' conviction was based on falsified reports and coerced testimony." The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "While we acknowledge certain irregularities in the original trial, perhaps a retrial would be more appropriate." "That won't be necessary," the judge interrupted, her voice firm. "This case was fundamentally flawed from its inception. The evidence of misconduct is overwhelming." Shaniqua held her breath as the judge continued. Time seemed to slow down as the words filled the courtroom. "In light of the new evidence, this court finds Jerome Williams innocent of all charges. He is to be released immediately." The words hung in the air for a moment before their meaning sank in. Latrice let out a sob, clutching Shaniqua's hand. Mike patted Rick's shoulder as tears welled up in the former officer's eyes. The courtroom doors opened and Jerome Williams stepped in, escorted by officers. His orange jumpsuit hung loose on his thin frame, and gray peppered his temples, but his eyes were bright and alert. When he saw his family, his face crumpled with emotion. Shaniqua and Latrice rushed forward as the officers removed Jerome's handcuffs. He wrapped his arms around them both, pulling them close. 12 years of separation poured out in their tears and trembling embraces. "My baby girl," Jerome whispered, holding Shaniqua's face in his hands. "Look how you've grown." "You're free now, Dad," Shaniqua whispered back through her tears. Rick watched the reunion from his seat, feeling the weight of years lift from his shoulders. Without drawing attention to himself, he stood and quietly made his way out of the courtroom. The courtroom was packed, every wooden bench filled with spectators. Shaniqua sat between her mother and Rick, her hands trembling as she watched the judge review the documents. The morning sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor. "Your Honor," the defense attorney stood, his voice clear and confident. "The evidence before you shows a pattern of misconduct that led to an innocent man spending 12 years behind bars. The surveillance footage that would have cleared Mr. Williams was deliberately suppressed. The key witness has signed an affidavit stating his testimony was coerced." The prosecutor shifted in his chair, his face flushed. "While we acknowledge there were irregularities in the original trial, the state believes a retrial would be the appropriate course of action." The judge peered over her glasses, her expression stern. "A retrial? With evidence this tainted? I don't think so, Counselor. This case was corrupted from the very beginning." Shaniqua squeezed her mother's hand as the judge continued speaking. The words seemed to float in the air. "In light of this overwhelming evidence of misconduct, this court finds Jerome Williams innocent of all charges. He is to be released immediately." Latrice let out a choked sob beside Shaniqua. Mike reached over and squeezed Rick's shoulder as the former officer wiped his eyes. The heavy courtroom doors opened with a creak. Jerome Williams entered, his orange jumpsuit hanging loose on his thin frame. Gray streaked his temples, and deep lines marked his face, but his eyes were bright and alert as they found his family. As the officers removed his handcuffs, Shaniqua and Latrice rushed forward. Jerome wrapped them both in his arms, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. 12 years of separation poured out in their embrace. "My baby girl," Jerome whispered, holding Shaniqua's face in his weathered hands. "Look at you. Look how beautiful you've grown." "You're free now, Dad," Shaniqua whispered through her tears. From his seat in the back of the courtroom, Rick watched the family reunion. A small smile crossed his face as he quietly stood and slipped out the heavy wooden doors. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Shaniqua Williams stood before the jury, her navy suit crisp and professional. At 32, she carried herself with quiet confidence, her voice clear and steady as she delivered her closing argument. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the prosecution's case rests entirely on circumstantial evidence. My client, Marcus Thompson, was at work during the alleged theft, a fact confirmed by multiple witnesses and security footage. This is not just about reasonable doubt. This is about an innocent young man whose life hangs in the balance." The jury listened intently, many nodding as she methodically dismantled the prosecution's case. When the verdict came back, not guilty, Marcus's family burst into tears, hugging each other tightly. His mother grabbed Shaniqua's hands, whispering "thank you" over and over. As the courtroom began to clear, Shaniqua noticed movement in the back row. There sat Rick Carter, his hair now completely gray, his face more lined but his eyes still sharp and alert. He smiled warmly at her, pride evident in his expression. Shaniqua made her way to him, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said softly. Rick stood slowly, his movements a bit stiffer than she remembered. "Couldn't miss your first big case," he replied. "You've become everything you set out to be, Shaniqua. Everything, and more." She felt tears prick at her corners of her eyes. "Thank you, Rick, for believing in us back then, for risking everything to help my father." The words felt different now, lighter somehow. The old anger that had lived in her chest for so long had finally dissolved completely. Rick's eyes grew misty. "Seeing you here today fighting for justice just like you always dreamed, it makes every sacrifice worth it." They shared a quiet moment, both understanding that something had shifted between them. The past hadn't changed, but its weight had finally lifted. Rick turned to leave, his steps slow but purposeful. Shaniqua watched him go, a small smile playing on her lips. She felt at peace, knowing they had both found their way to redemption. If you enjoyed the story of Shaniqua, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.